There is a moment in every person's life when their mind becomes their greatest enemy. When the voice inside their head whispers that they should quit, that they should give up, that the pain is too much and the path forward is impossible to navigate. This is not a moment of weakness, but a moment of truth. A crossroads where ordinary people separate themselves from those who achieve extraordinary things. And it was precisely in understanding this universal human struggle that Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the legendary warrior and philosopher of ancient Japan, developed one of the most powerful teachings in the history of human development. The ability to force your mind to obey even when every fiber of your being wants to surrender. You are about to discover the secret that allowed Yoshitsune to overcome impossible odds, to triumph when defeat seemed certain, and to develop an unbreakable mental discipline that transformed him from a young exile into one of the most celebrated figures in Japanese history. But more importantly, you will learn how to apply this ancient wisdom to conquer your own mental resistance and achieve victories that currently seem impossible in your own life. Before we dive deep into this transformative knowledge, I need you to engage with this content because what I am about to share with you has the power to change everything about how you approach challenges, setbacks, and the voice in your head that tells you to quit. So please hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and in the comments below, share with us the one area of your life where your mind most often tries to convince you to give up, because by sharing your struggle, you not only help yourself process this weakness, but you also help others realize they are not alone in this internal battle. The story I'm about to tell you happened over 800 years ago, but it could have happened yesterday because the human mind has not changed. Our struggles with mental resistance remain the same, and the solutions that worked then work now with even greater power because we understand them more deeply. Yoshitsune was born into a world where giving up meant death, where mental weakness was not just a personal failure, but a threat to survival itself. Yet even in this harsh environment, he discovered that the greatest battles were not fought with swords against external enemies, but with will against the internal enemy of mental surrender. When Yoshitsune was still a young man, barely past his teenage years, he found himself facing an impossible situation that would have broken most people before they even attempted to fight back. His older brother, Minamoto no Yoritomo, had become the most powerful military leader in Japan. But instead of welcoming Yoshitsune into his ranks, Yoritomo saw him as a threat and began systematically destroying everything Yoshitsune had built, turning allies against him, cutting off his resources, and forcing him into exile with nowhere to run and no one to trust. Most people in this situation would have accepted defeat, would have fled to a distant province and lived quietly, would have let their mind convince them that survival was more important than honor or purpose. But Yoshitsune did something that reveals the core of his mental mastery. He developed what he called the practice of kokoro no shihai, which translates to the sovereignty of the heart over mind, a systematic method for overriding mental resistance and forcing the mind to obey the deeper wisdom of the spirit, even when logic and emotion screamed for retreat. The first principle of kokoro no shihai is the recognition that the mind is not your ally in moments of crisis, that it is designed by evolution to keep you safe, not to help you achieve greatness, and that its primary function is to convince you to avoid risk, to choose the path of least resistance, to give up before you get hurt. Yoshitsune understood that this mental programming, which served our ancestors well when survival was the primary concern, becomes a prison when you are trying to achieve something significant, something that requires you to push beyond the boundaries of comfort and safety into the realm where extraordinary results are created. When you understand this fundamental truth about the mind, you stop fighting against your thoughts and instead learn to observe them with the detachment of a warrior who knows that the enemy's strategy is predictable and therefore can be countered with systematic precision. Yoshitsune would spend hours in meditation, not to empty his mind of thoughts, but to study the patterns of mental resistance, to understand exactly how his mind tried to convince him to quit, what arguments it used, what emotions it triggered, what scenarios it painted to make surrender seem reasonable and intelligent. Through this practice, he discovered that mental resistance follows predictable patterns, that it always attacks at specific moments, uses certain types of arguments, and triggers particular emotional responses. And once you map these patterns, you can prepare countermeasures that neutralize the mind's attempts to derail your progress. The second principle of kokoro no shihai is the development of what Yoshitsune called tamashi no koe, the voice of the soul, which is the deep inner knowing that exists beneath the chatter of mental resistance, the part of you that knows what you are truly capable of achieving, and refuses to accept anything less than your highest potential. This voice is always present, but in most people it is drowned out by the louder, more urgent demands of mental comfort, social approval, and emotional safety. Yet when you learn to access this deeper voice and give it authority over your actions, you discover a source of motivation and determination that cannot be exhausted because it comes from your essential nature rather than from external circumstances. Yoshitsune developed specific practices for strengthening this inner voice and giving it dominance over mental resistance, practices that modern neuroscience has proven to be incredibly effective at rewiring the brain for resilience and determination. He would begin each day before dawn with a practice he called Tamashi no Mezame, the awakening of the soul, where he would sit in silence and ask himself 3 specific questions. What is my deepest purpose in this situation? What would I do if I knew I could not fail? What action would I take if I were already the person I am trying to become? These questions bypass the mental resistance entirely because they speak directly to the deeper wisdom that exists beneath fear and doubt, and when you answer them honestly, you receive guidance that comes from a place of strength rather than weakness, from possibility rather than limitation, from your highest potential rather than your current circumstances. The power of these questions lies not in their complexity, but in their ability to shift your perspective from what you cannot do to what you must do, from what might go wrong to what could go right, from who you have been to who you are becoming. And when you make decisions from this elevated perspective, your mind has no choice but to follow because you have given it clear direction based on principles rather than fears. But knowing what to do and actually doing it when your mind is screaming for you to quit are 2 completely different challenges. And this is where Yoshitsune's 3rd principle becomes crucial. Kishi no Senryaku, the strategy of the decisive moment, which is a systematic approach to taking action even when every part of you wants to stop, hesitate, or reconsider. Yoshitsune discovered that there is always a specific moment in every challenging situation when the mind makes its strongest attempt to convince you to give up. And he called this the Ketsudan no Toki, the moment of decision when your next action will determine whether you move toward your goal or away from it, whether you honor your deeper purpose or surrender to mental comfort, whether you become stronger or weaker as a result of this experience. The strategy for this decisive moment is deceptively simple, but requires tremendous courage to implement. You must take the next right action immediately, without thinking, without analyzing, without considering alternatives. Because any delay gives the mind time to construct elaborate arguments for why quitting is the intelligent choice. Yoshitsune trained himself to recognize the moment when mental resistance peaked, and instead of trying to overcome it through willpower or positive thinking, he would immediately engage in physical action that moved him toward his goal, because he understood that action changes state faster than thought, that movement creates momentum, and that momentum makes the next right action easier to take. When his mind told him that challenging his brother's forces was suicide, he immediately began preparations for battle. When fear whispered that his men would abandon him, he immediately called them together and shared his vision of victory. When doubt suggested that his resources were insufficient, he immediately began developing creative strategies for achieving more with less. In each case, he bypassed mental resistance by moving from contemplation to action so quickly that his mind did not have time to mount an effective argument for retreat. This strategy works because the mind requires time to build compelling cases for quitting, but action interrupts this process and creates evidence of progress that the mind must acknowledge. And when you consistently demonstrate through your actions that you are serious about your goals, your mind begins to align with your direction rather than fighting against it. I need to pause here and speak directly to you, because I know that as you listen to these principles, your mind is already beginning to construct arguments for why this approach might not work for you, why your situation is different, why you have tried similar things before without success. And this is exactly the mental resistance that Yoshitsune is teaching you to recognize and override. Your mind is doing its job, which is to protect you from risk and uncertainty. But protection and growth cannot coexist, and if you want to achieve something you have never achieved, you must be willing to become someone you have never been. And that requires overriding the mental programming that has kept you safe, but small. The question you need to ask yourself right now is this: how much longer are you willing to let your mind make decisions for you based on fear rather than faith, on limitation rather than possibility, on who you have been rather than who you could become? Please pause for a moment and write in the comments below, using these exact words. I am ready to stop letting my mind control my destiny. Because when you make this declaration publicly, you are making a commitment not just to yourself, but to everyone who reads it. And that social accountability becomes a powerful force for following through on your decision to apply these teachings. The fourth principle of Kokoro no Shihai addresses the most difficult aspect of mental mastery: maintaining discipline over time. Because taking right action in a moment of inspiration is relatively easy, but continuing to take right action day after day, week after week, when progress is slow and obstacles multiply, requires a different level of mental sovereignty. Yoshitsune called this Jizoku no Chikara, the power of persistence, and he developed specific strategies for maintaining momentum even when external circumstances made continuing seem pointless or impossible. The key insight is that mental resistance does not remain constant, but follows predictable cycles, becoming stronger at certain times and weaker at others. And if you understand these cycles, you can time your most important actions for periods when resistance is naturally lower, and prepare for periods when resistance peaks. Yoshitsune noticed that mental resistance was always strongest in the early morning, late evening, and during transitions between activities, times when the mind was not fully engaged, and therefore had energy available for generating doubts and fears. He countered this by scheduling his most challenging tasks during periods of natural mental clarity, typically mid-morning and mid-afternoon, and he used the periods of high resistance for routine activities that required minimal mental energy. More importantly, he prepared specific countermeasures for the predictable arguments his mind would present during high-resistance periods, writing down exactly what thoughts would arise and exactly how he would respond to them, so that when mental resistance peaked, he did not have to think about how to handle it, but could implement pre-planned responses automatically. This preparation is crucial because when you are in the grip of mental resistance, your capacity for clear thinking is compromised, your judgment is clouded by emotion, and your ability to remember why your goals matter is diminished, so you cannot rely on your ability to make good decisions in these moments, but must instead rely on decisions you made when your thinking was clear and your motivation was strong. Yoshitsune would write what he called his Shinin no Tagami, letters to his future self, documents that reminded him of his deeper purpose, his past victories, and his reasons for continuing when everything seemed hopeless. And he would read these letters whenever mental resistance threatened to derail his progress, allowing his clearest thinking to guide his most difficult moments. The practice of writing to your future self is one of the most powerful techniques for overcoming mental resistance, because it allows you to separate the decision-making process from the execution process, making your most important choices when you are thinking clearly rather than when you are struggling with doubt and fear. In your letter to your future self, you explain why your goal matters, what you are willing to sacrifice to achieve it, what arguments your mind will use to convince you to quit, and what evidence from your past proves that you are capable of overcoming this challenge, creating a resource you can return to when your perspective becomes clouded by temporary difficulties. The fifth and final principle of Kokoro no Shihai is perhaps the most profound: Kansha no Kakume, the revolution of gratitude, which transforms your relationship with difficulty from something to be avoided into something to be embraced as the path to mental strength. Yoshitsune discovered that mental resistance loses much of its power when you stop seeing challenges as problems and start seeing them as opportunities to develop the exact qualities you need to achieve your goals. Because every moment of wanting to quit is actually a moment when you can choose to become stronger. Every urge to give up is an invitation to discover depths of determination you did not know you possessed, and every experience of pushing through mental resistance builds your capacity to handle even greater challenges in the future. This shift in perspective is revolutionary because it changes suffering from a meaningless burden into a meaningful investment, from something that depletes you into something that strengthens you, from an obstacle to your goals into the very path that leads to their achievement. When Yoshitsune faced his darkest hour, when his brother's armies had cornered him and defeat seemed certain, instead of cursing his circumstances, he thanked them for providing the exact test he needed to prove his true character, for forcing him to discover resources within himself he had never accessed, for giving him the opportunity to demonstrate that his principles were stronger than his fears. This gratitude was not positive thinking or self-deception, but a strategic choice to extract maximum value from inevitable suffering, to ensure that every difficulty served his growth rather than his destruction, to transform every challenge into evidence of his increasing strength rather than proof of his limitations. When you adopt this perspective, something magical happens. Your mind stops seeing challenges as threats to be avoided and starts seeing them as opportunities to be leveraged. And when your mind is aligned with your growth rather than fighting against it, you discover that you have access to resources and capabilities you never imagined possible. The practical application of these 5 principles requires understanding how they work together as an integrated system rather than isolated techniques, because mental mastery is not achieved through sporadic efforts, but through consistent practice that gradually reshapes your default responses to pressure, uncertainty, and difficulty. In your personal life, this means developing the habit of questioning every impulse to quit, every suggestion that you should settle for less, every argument that you should be realistic about your limitations, because these thoughts are not insights, but obstacles, not wisdom, but weakness, not protection, but prison. When you wake up and feel like staying in bed instead of pursuing your goals, you immediately engage the practice of Tamashi no Koe and ask yourself what your highest self would do in this moment. Then take that action without delay. When you face a setback and feel like giving up on your dreams, you immediately implement Kishi no Senryaku and take the next right step toward your goal, no matter how small, because action creates momentum, and momentum overcomes resistance. When you feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of your challenges, you immediately practice Kansha no Kakume, and thank these difficulties for providing exactly the training you need to develop the character required for your ultimate success. In your relationships, these principles transform how you handle conflict, disappointment, and the urge to withdraw when things become difficult. Because instead of letting your mind convince you that problems are proof that the relationship is not worth the effort, you recognize them as opportunities to develop deeper understanding, stronger communication skills, and more authentic intimacy. When disagreements arise and your mind wants to prove you are right rather than find solutions, you engage Kokoro no Shihai and ask what response would serve the relationship rather than your ego. When your partner disappoints you, and you feel like pulling away, you practice Tamashi no Koe and ask what your most loving self would do, then choose connection over protection. When relationship challenges trigger old patterns of fear and defensiveness, you implement Jizoku no Chikara and maintain your commitment to growth rather than reverting to comfort. In your professional life, these principles give you the mental strength to pursue ambitious goals, to persist through setbacks, to maintain high standards when others settle for mediocrity, and to build the reputation of someone who delivers results regardless of circumstances. When projects become difficult, and your mind suggests that you should lower your standards or reduce your efforts, you immediately apply Kishi no Senryaku and increase your commitment rather than decrease it. When colleagues doubt your vision and pressure you to conform to limited thinking, you practice Tamashi no Koe and stay connected to your deeper purpose rather than seeking approval. When progress is slower than expected and you feel like abandoning your long-term goals, you implement Jizoku no Chikara and maintain consistent effort while others give up. The power of Yoshitsune's teachings lies not in their complexity, but in their simplicity, not in requiring special talents, but in developing ordinary discipline, not in promising easy results, but in providing reliable methods for achieving extraordinary outcomes through consistent application of timeless principles. You now possess the same knowledge that allowed a young man in ancient Japan to overcome impossible odds and achieve legendary status. But knowledge without application is worthless, and application without commitment is temporary. The question that will determine your future is not whether you understand these principles, but whether you will implement them consistently enough to transform them from interesting ideas into automatic habits, from intellectual concepts into lived realities, from something you know into something you are. Your mind will immediately begin generating reasons why you should wait to start applying these teachings, why you should modify them to fit your comfort zone, why you should test them gradually rather than committing fully. And every one of these suggestions is mental resistance in disguise. Your mind's attempt to maintain its control over your decisions and keep you trapped in patterns that feel safe but produce mediocre results. The choice you make in the next 24 hours will reveal whether you are truly ready to force your mind to obey your deeper wisdom, or whether you will continue letting mental comfort determine the boundaries of your life. If you are ready to begin this transformation, I need you to take 3 specific actions right now, while your motivation is strong and your vision is clear, because action taken immediately has power that action delayed loses forever. First, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you continue receiving the wisdom and strategies you need to build mental mastery over time. Because transformation is not a single event but a gradual process that requires consistent input of the right information and regular reminders of your commitment to growth. Second, Write in the comments below exactly which of Yoshitsune's 5 principles resonates most strongly with your current situation, and describe one specific action you will take in the next 24 hours to begin implementing this principle in your life, because public commitment creates accountability that private intention lacks. Third, share this video with someone you care about who is struggling with mental resistance in their own life, because teaching others reinforces your own learning and creates a community of people who support each other's growth rather than enabling each other's limitations. The ancient wisdom of Minamoto no Yoshitsune has waited over 800 years to reach you. And now that it has, the only question remaining is what you will do with this gift of knowledge that has the power to transform every aspect of your life, if you have the courage to apply it consistently and completely.